Hi guys, it's Spencer. Welcome to Sphinx Reads. Today I'll be reviewing books 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians series by Brandon Sanderson. So if you haven't seen my review for the first book yet, I'll have that linked in the description as well as in the cards. But if you have, you may remember that I was initially planning on doing like two book reviews, like one for book 2 and 3 and then another for books 4 and 5. Unfortunately, due to timing, I just didn't have the opportunity to do a review for books 2 and 3. However, I think this still works out well because I don't have a lot to say about books 4 and 5 and really for each of the books in general, and I just didn't feel like a dedicated review for each of the books was necessary. So what I'm going to do today is actually going to be just like my brief thoughts on each of the books, and then I'll give my overall feelings about the series. Okay, so first is book 2. We have The Scrivener's Bones. After finishing book 1, I was a little bit skeptical that I'd be interested in continuing with the series, but reading book 2, I think book 2 is probably my favorite in the entire series. I don't know what changed exactly, but I just appreciated the humor in book 2 a lot more than in book 1. Things also get a little bit more interesting in terms of plot. I was most interested in book 2. This is definitely true for book 2, but also for the rest of the series. I feel like book 1 could kind of work as a standalone, and the rest of the series I feel like is more structured. It's a bit more tonally different, where in book 1 it feels a little bit directionless and like, what the heck are we doing here? Like books 2 to 5 feel more like they have a direction, like we have a little bit more structure and we kind of know where we're going exactly. That said, after reading book 2 and getting into book 3, I feel like book 2 was a little bit more of a side adventure, which only really introduced a few new characters who are important in the next books, but in terms of just driving the plot forward, it felt more like a side adventure. I guess I haven't really talked about what book 2 is about. Each of the books are actually kind of episodic, like they're set in different locations. So book 1, we follow Alcatraz and a bunch of other people like try to infiltrate this library, and in book 2 they also try to infiltrate a library, but this is a special library because it's actually the Library of Alexandria, and Alcatraz hears from his grandfather that his father might be there, and so they're going to try to rescue him. I love the overall mystery feeling of book 2, which we did have a little bit of in the rest of the book, but I don't know what it was. It was just that book 2 was the most interesting plot to me, and I gave it 4 stars. Goodreads. Now, actually getting into book 3. So I rated this 3.5 stars. I didn't think it was as good as book 2. So in book 3, what happens is we finally go to Valhalla, which is like the American equivalent in the Free Kingdoms, or like the Kingdoms of the Smedries. This book feels more like a continuation of book 1. We do miss a lot of the characters that were introduced in book 2, but some of the characters that were in book 1 are brought back into the picture, which I really enjoyed. I particularly love the plot twists in this book. It was just really like fun. Overall, the series is super fun. It's really wacky, and just like things were just super ridiculous. Like I said before, it's kind of like a series of unfortunate events, but make it more sci-fi and make it more fantasy. I think in book 3 we also get to see more character development for Alcatraz, which I really enjoyed because, I don't know, book 1 and 2, although I did enjoy book 2, I didn't feel like Alcatraz as a character really developed all that much. So it was cool to see more development in Alcatraz's character in book 3. In book 4, TheShatteredLens, I also rated this 3.5. Despite enjoying it, I still didn't think it was as good as book 2. But in this episode, or this book, we actually go to Mokia, which is kind of the Polynesian equivalent of the Free Kingdom. So you have Valhalla, which is kind of like the US, and then you have Mokia, which is like the Polynesian islands, but like they're just like one like country. Out of all the 5 books, this book feels more like sci-fi than fantasy. It definitely has more technology elements involved. There aren't a lot of new characters introduced in book 4, but the ones who are, I really love. I enjoy like seeing these new characters. However, I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't get to see some of the characters that were introduced in the previous books again. I would love to have them just kind of like come together, especially since the setting of this book was really fascinating and I wanted to, I guess, spend more time in this place, but with like more of the characters that I've already come to know and love. It also gets a little bit more dark in book 4. And I think another thing that you have to know is that whereas you can, read book 1 and then stop there, and then read book 2 and then stop there, and read book 3 and then stop there, like you don't, at least for me, like although there are like still like ongoing mysteries, like you can stop at like book 2 or book 3 or book 1, and be totally fine. After you finish book 4, it ends up on kind of like a cliffhanger, so you would want to continue to read book 5. Overall, I thought book 4 was, as I wrote in my notes, it's just like beautifully chaotic. There's just a lot going on. I think this was the most like action-packed. Actually, no, books 4 and 5 were very action-packed. Even though all throughout the series there's always something going on, I think in books 4 and 5 particularly, there is a lot of like things going on one after the other. Finally, book 5, The Dark-Talent. I rated this 4 stars because, okay, so let me explain. So for most of the book, I think it was just my mood. I was just like not in the mood to read Alcatraz. Number one, because I was actually reading this at the same time as Neverseen, which is also another middle grade series, and like for both of those, like because I was reading them at the same time, and this is my fault. Like I just like wasn't vibing with either of them because I wasn't invested in one story. Like taking a step back and like reviewing like all the events that happened in book 5, everything that happens in book 5 is pretty fascinating. It's very action packed, and I love seeing again some characters that were introduced in the previous books. However, again, even in book 5, there were like some characters that I wanted to see again, but they just weren't there, and I just feel like they were a little bit forgotten. In book 5, it actually takes place in the Library of Congress in the US, which they refer to as the Highbrary. So they're trying to infiltrate this library, and by the time you reach book 5, there are like multiple villains, and a lot of them are really morally gray, so you don't know who to side with, which I really appreciated, because for a series that's super short and super like wacky and to the point, there was still like morally gray characters which could like start a discussion, especially for middle grade readers reading this for school. While the dialogue in books 2 to 4 was pretty funny, I felt that the humor was particularly strong in book 5. The humor is strong mainly because of Alcatraz's like unreliable narration, but in book 5, I would say that the quality of the humor owes a lot more to the dialogue than just the narration. Actually, as I was reading this, again, I was a little bit not into it, but I was feeling that I would maybe rate it like 3 stars or something. But the ending was just really impactful and really emotional and abrupt, that I was just like left thinking and had to rate this like 4 stars. So that's the main reason that this became a 4-star read for me, was because of the ending. I feel like this is one of those series that like I'm glad I read this, mainly because it was recommended to me by a friend who thought that I would really appreciate this. But even though I appreciated reading this, I feel like this wasn't exactly to my taste. My ratings were mainly I felt like it wasn't necessarily because of like the enjoyment, but mainly the level of appreciation that I have for it. At the heart of this series like is the humor, and I feel like if the humor works for you, the series is not going to work for you, and it kind of didn't work for me. But I feel like if the humor had worked for me in this series, my ratings would have been a little bit more heartfelt, if that makes sense. Overall, I like this series, but even though I'm not opposed to continuing with the spin-off series that is to come in the next decade or so. I mean, Brandon Sanderson's he has a lot of projects to work on. Continuing on with the spin-off series is definitely not a priority for me. I have a lot of other series that I'm definitely more interested in. But that's not to say that I didn't have a good time reading this series, because I definitely did. I loved Alcatraz's humor. I mean, I'm contradicting myself, but I mean, I loved it in some parts, but then there were other parts that I was just like, Those are really all of my overall thoughts for books 2 to 5 in the Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians series. I hope it wasn't too rambly. I feel like it was, but I mean, I tried to like divide it into like my thoughts for each of the book, but I feel like I kind of like meshed them all together, like all my general thoughts on the series. But at the same time, I kind of don't regret doing this as a 4-book review, because I feel like if you liked the first book, then the series just gets better. And if you did like the first book, why would you continue with the series? And if you're like on the fence in terms of like whether or not you like the first book, I feel like you either just continue on with the rest of the series or you just don't. Either way, I hope that this was somehow helpful to you, and if you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and please forget to subscribe so that you can do it later, and have a great day.